There's a specific kind of dread that builds when a YouTube channel you've followed for years just stops. No goodbye video, no pinned post, no "we're taking a break" story on Instagram, just nothing. For over 1 million people who had followed Eamon Bec through van builds, cancer treatment, cabin renovations, and everything in between, that silence arrived like a cold front. And the longer it lasted, the darker people's theories got. Some were convinced the baby hadn't survived. Others feared something had happened to Bec herself. What was actually unfolding behind the scenes was worse than most imagined, and the full picture didn't emerge for weeks. But to understand what happened, you have to go back to the beginning. Because this story didn't start with a crisis. It started with two people quitting their jobs and driving into the unknown. Eamon Fitzgerald and Rebecca Maroney were both working corporate jobs in Toronto when they decided they were done with that life. They weren't running from something. They just wanted more than a desk, a commute, and a lease renewal. Their first taste of van life came on a trip to New Zealand, where they rented a camper and spent months driving between islands, cooking their own meals, waking up wherever they parked. That was the moment something clicked. They came home to Canada and almost immediately bought a used 2008 Mercedes Sprinter van. 30 days later, they'd converted it into a livable home on wheels. They also ran a tea company. Chaiwala, their handmade chai blend, had been selling to neighborhood cafes in Toronto, but scaling it meant traveling, flying across the country, booking hotels, renting cars. The van solved all of that at once. They loaded it up, hit the road, and started filming. Their YouTube channel launched in 2014, but it was the van content that built the audience, and it built it slowly. One of their quotes in an early podcast described it perfectly. The overnight success that took 10 years to build. For a long time, they were grinding, uploading every Sunday, driving through Canada, the US, Mexico, then across the Atlantic to Europe. They eventually shipped the van to Morocco and kept going. When COVID shut down travel and stranded them mid-trip, they improvised, flew home to Canada, quarantined, and started building their second Sprinter van from scratch. By late 2020, they bought a cabin on a lakeside in Ontario. The whole renovation went on camera. The channel kept growing, past 500,000, then 1 million subscribers. They were living the life they'd built on purpose. And then, in December 2021, a phone call changed everything. On December 21st, 2021, Bec was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. She published the diagnosis on Instagram with the date right in the caption. The type was invasive ductal carcinoma, estrogen positive, meaning the hormone estrogen was actively feeding the tumor. The staging had actually shifted upward. The initial assessment suggested it might be stage 0. But when the lumpectomy surgery revealed that cancer cells were present throughout the tissue margins, essentially all around the removed area, the classification was updated to stage 3. The lymph nodes that were tested came back clear, which was a relief, but the margin situation meant the disease was more advanced than first thought. Her doctor laid out the options around surgery. Because Bec's cancer didn't appear to be connected to a genetic mutation like BRCA, the clinical recommendation was that a lumpectomy carried a recurrence risk only slightly higher than a full mastectomy, just over 10% versus just under. Bec chose the lumpectomy. What followed was one of the most documented cancer journeys on YouTube. In January 2022, the full treatment plan began. Before a single dose of chemo, Bec and Eamon went through a full round of IVF to freeze embryos and preserve their fertility, because Bec's doctors were upfront that chemotherapy and hormonal treatments could trigger early menopause and significantly reduce or eliminate her chances of conceiving naturally. 8 rounds of intensive chemotherapy followed, running through May 2022. Then a partial mastectomy, then 20 rounds of radiation. She lost her hair, she documented it. from 16 inches cut short ahead of treatment to fully bald, to watching it grow back. Hundreds of thousands of people watched every step of that journey alongside her, and the community that had formed around their adventures on the road became something deeper, a support network for someone fighting for her life. By July 2022, the news was good. Surgery had confirmed no tumor was found. The treatment had worked. Scans came back clear. Bec was in remission. After everything, after the IVF and the chemo and the radiation and the hair loss and the months of physical and emotional devastation, it had worked. They had gotten through it. Except the story wasn't over, not even close. In April 2023, they posted a video that rattled their audience before most people even understood why. The caption mentioned that they'd been called back for another mammogram and biopsy and that it had sent them into a bit of a spiral. They debated whether to post it at all, they said, but the community had been with them from day one. It felt wrong to hide it. The biopsy results ultimately did not confirm a recurrence at that time, but the scare was real, and for anyone paying attention, it underscored just how close to the surface the fear of this cancer coming back really was. And yet, shortly after remission was confirmed, Bec became pregnant. This is the part of their story that still sparks the most debate online, and it's worth laying out exactly why, because it's not as simple as people wanting a baby. The medical reality of Bec's specific cancer type made the timing of the pregnancy genuinely complicated. Invasive ductal carcinoma that is estrogen positive behaves exactly the way the name suggests. Estrogen is what fuels it. Standard oncology protocol for this type of cancer typically requires patients to complete 18 months to 2 years of endocrine therapy, hormone-blocking treatment, before attempting pregnancy. The reason isn't arbitrary caution. It's because the first 2 years after treatment carry the highest risk of recurrence, and because pregnancy floods the body with estrogen, which is precisely the hormone that had been feeding the tumor. Multiple oncologists who have commented publicly on cases like Bec's have noted that a patient should ideally still be on hormone-blocking drugs when attempting pregnancy, which would make conception biologically impossible. One woman who was diagnosed with the same cancer type at the same time as Bec, writing on a Reddit thread dedicated to Eamon and Bec's life update, put it plainly. The standard recommendation is 18 months to 2 years of endocrine therapy before attempting pregnancy, and that therapy alone would have made pregnancy impossible during that window. Whether Bec's own oncologist signed off on the pregnancy has never been definitively clarified. The couple implied in various statements that they had medical guidance, but other accounts, and none of them confirmed, suggested the doctor's reaction when they announced the pregnancy was one of shock rather than approval. None of that has been verified by the people involved. What is known is that Bec did have frozen embryos from the IVF done before treatment. The desire to have children had always been part of their plan, and given the uncertainty around whether chemo might have permanently affected her fertility, the window they chose felt, to them, like the right time. The community, with the benefit of medical knowledge many had picked up following Bec's cancer journey, was more divided. During the pregnancy, Bec began experiencing persistent shoulder pain. It didn't go away. And when it was investigated, what the scan showed was devastating. The cancer had come back, and this time it wasn't stage 3, it was stage 4, metastatic. The disease had spread, tumors in her bones, tumors in her liver. The surge of estrogen from the pregnancy hadn't caused the recurrence from nothing. The cancer had been there, but the hormonal environment had accelerated its growth dramatically. Doctors were now managing 2 things at once: a growing baby and a rapidly spreading disease. The decision made was medically brutal, but necessary. Frankie Lee Fitzgerald was delivered 6 weeks early. The reasoning was direct. Delivering the baby would dramatically reduce the estrogen in Bec's body, removing the primary driver of the tumor growth as quickly as possible. Frankie survived. She was placed in the NICU, the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, where she would spend the next 15 days. Bec, having just delivered a premature infant, began treatment immediately, hormone-blocking therapy to suppress estrogen and target the cancer that had spread to multiple sites in her body. The liver metastases, which are among the most serious indicators of advanced cancer, started responding to the treatment. That was meaningful. But stage 4 metastatic breast cancer is not curable, it's treatable. The goal shifts from elimination to management, from remission to living well for as long as possible. The channel said nothing about any of this. What the outside world saw was a channel that had been actively posting, and then wasn't. The last video had ended on what many viewers described as a cliffhanger. There was no birth announcement, no update on Bec, no "we need some time" message, just silence. For weeks. The longer it went on, the more extreme the community's theories became. Comment sections and dedicated forums filled with worst-case speculation. People were genuinely convinced that Frankie hadn't survived, because, they reasoned, no parent who had gone through what Eamon and Bec had gone through would stay completely silent if everything was okay. Others were convinced that Bec had taken a sharp turn for the worse and that posting anything felt impossible. Some in the community felt the silence was compassionate under the circumstances. When you are dealing with a premature baby in the NICU and a stage 4 cancer diagnosis simultaneously, the idea that you owe your audience an update feels almost absurd. But others, and this was a vocal contingent, felt that the silence wasn't just absence. It was a choice that left people fearing the worst, and that a single sentence confirming the baby was alive and that Bec was in treatment would have spared a lot of unnecessary anguish. The debate about creator responsibility, about what is owed to an audience when your life becomes genuinely life or death, played out in real time across every platform Eamon and Bec had built their brand on. On April 14, 2024, the video finally came. Titled simply "Life Update," it ran without fanfare. In it, Eamon and Bec laid out the full picture: the stage 4 diagnosis, the premature delivery, the NICU. Bec beginning treatment immediately post-birth. They described it as sharing the truth once they felt ready to share it, not when the internet demanded it. The response was enormous. The video pulled millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments, many from people who had been following their channel since the Van days, who felt like they were hearing the news from people they actually knew. The emotional weight of it was unusual even by the standards of deeply personal creator content. But alongside the outpouring of support, the more difficult conversation was also happening. Once the immediate shock settled, a quieter but persistent thread emerged across forums and comment sections, focused not just on what had happened, but on why. People with knowledge of estrogen-positive breast cancer were asking the same question. Given everything that was documented about Bec's diagnosis, about her cancer type, about the specific risks of pregnancy too soon after treatment, how did this happen? The medical community online wasn't cruel about it, mostly, but it was direct. The recommended waiting window existed precisely for this scenario. The endocrine therapy that should have followed radiation was the line of defense between remission and the estrogen environment that pregnancy creates. Without it, or without completing it, the risk was real and documented. Some users pointed specifically at Eamon. There were claims, it unverified, sourced from community forums rather than confirmed reporting, that Eamon had been eager to start a family even before the cancer diagnosis, and that his attitude toward conventional medicine was more skeptical than Bec's. There were suggestions that he had pushed toward pregnancy before the recommended window was complete. None of that has been confirmed by either of them. It's worth stating clearly, The people closest to this situation have not publicly assigned blame to each other, and anything written in anonymous online forums is speculation. But it was a conversation that their community was openly having, and it shaped how a significant portion of their audience processed the life update. What wasn't speculative was the practical reality. The April 30th, 2023 mammogram callback, just months before the pregnancy would have become publicly known, showed that Bec had already been navigating fear of recurrence during this period. The shoulder pain that eventually led to the stage 4 diagnosis had initially been attributed to normal pregnancy discomfort. By the time it was investigated seriously, the disease had already progressed. 15 days in a NICU. A baby born before her lungs were fully ready for the world, while her mother was starting aggressive treatment in the same building. By mid-2024, Eamon Bec were posting again, not at the same pace as before, not with the same carefree travel energy that had made their channel what it was, but they were there. Baby Frankie, who had spent those first 15 days fighting to breathe on her own, was growing. In October 2024, Eamon Bec appeared on Matt and Abby's Unplanned podcast, one of the more widely listened to couples creator podcasts in that space. They discussed the whole story: van life, the cancer, the pregnancy, the NICU stay, what it meant to be engaged for 7 years, and what their future looked like now. It was the most comprehensive public account they'd given outside of the life update video, and it reached a new audience who hadn't been following since the beginning. The vans, both of them, had officially been sold in July 2023. That video had its own emotional weight. 6 years of van life, 3 separate sprinter builds, Morocco and Mexico, and the mountains of Canada. All of it had been lived and documented in those 2 vehicles. Selling them wasn't just a practical decision. It was a chapter closing. The life they'd built their brand on, the freedom that had made 1 million people subscribe, was over. What had replaced it looked nothing like what they started. They launched a podcast of their own called Reroute, a name that said something about where they were, not rerouting as in a temporary detour. Rerouting, starting over from the ground up somewhere new. The content shifted. The audience that had originally come for van build guides and exotic travel footage was now following something closer to a real-time document of 2 people trying to figure out how to live well under impossible circumstances. The question people keep asking, if you spend any time in Eamon Bec comment sections today, isn't about the vans or even about the YouTube channel, it's about Bec. Stage 4 metastatic breast cancer is a disease that medicine has gotten significantly better at managing over the past decade. But managing is the operative word. The liver metastases responding to treatment is a meaningful sign. It means the approach is working. It means the disease is not accelerating unchecked. But the honest context is that stage 4 is a different category than what Bec had been fighting in 2022. The goalposts are different. The timeline is uncertain in ways that earlier stage cancer is not. Eamon said something in the life update video that stuck with a lot of people who watched it. He said there was no one else he would want to mother his child. It was the kind of sentence that lands differently depending on what you read into it. Some heard it as a loving tribute from a partner who'd been through hell alongside someone. Others heard it as a man who understood more than he was saying about what the future might hold. Neither interpretation is something either of them has confirmed, but it's the sentence that people keep coming back to. What Eamon Bec built over more than a decade wasn't a brand in the conventional content creator sense. It was something closer to an ongoing account of a life being lived imperfectly, openly, with all the mess that real lives contain: the van, the tea company, the cabin, the cancer, the IVF, the remission, the scare, the pregnancy, the baby, the stage 4 diagnosis, the silence, the return. That arc, which started with 2 people converting a van in 30 days and dreaming about driving to Morocco, has taken them somewhere that no amount of YouTube analytics or subscriber growth could have predicted. There are still people who don't know the full story. People who clicked on the channel once during the van life era and moved on. People who have no idea that behind the aesthetic of minimalist living and woodland Ontario mornings was a couple navigating something that most people never face once in a lifetime, and that Bec has now faced twice. The story isn't finished, and for everyone who has followed since the beginning, that's both the hardest and the most important thing to hold on to.